Hi everyone, quick disclaimer before we get into the video. There is no one single way to memorize the unit circle. Outside of what I'm saying in this video, there are plenty more patterns that can help you kind of connect the dots and figure out what goes where. So with that being said, just know that these are tips that I found along the way when I was memorizing the circle that helps me the best personally. Taking a look at a full unit circle for the very first time can be pretty intimidating. I mean, we've got degrees, radians, and in these ordered pairs are cosine and sine. And we're expected to memorize all of these in any pre-calculus class, algebra 2, or calculus especially. Taking a look at a blank one, it can get pretty intimidating, but the first thing to know is that you shouldn't be overwhelmed. Nearly everyone can memorize the unit circle, including you, so just know that at the beginning, things may be a little rough, but as you practice with blank circles, you can understand that it can get simpler along the way. So the first thing we're going to cover are the degrees. So the first landmark degree we have is 0 degrees. So the increments for degrees, excluding these kind of intermediate bubbles here, are of 30. So if we were going positive, we'd add 30 degrees to 0 and we get 30 degrees. The same could be done vice versa. We could subtract 30 from 360 and get 330 if we're going the opposite way. Now, using these principles, we could continue adding 30 counterclockwise. And so we get 60 degrees, then 90 degrees, which, as you can see, is a right angle, 120 degrees, 150 degrees, 180, which is a straight line, 210, 240, 270, and last but not least, 300. Now that we have those out of the way, let's discuss these four kind of intermediate circles between some 30 increments. So they're evenly spaced, as you can see. So what that means is that we're either going to add 15 to the previous bubble or subtract 15 from the next bubble. So adding 15 to 30 would give us 45, or if we subtracted 15 from 150, we'd get 135. This bubble is 225, and this one is 315. Next, let's discuss radians. So don't be intimidated by this new vocabulary. Just know that it's another unit for measuring angles. Just like how feet, inches, and meters all measure distance, but they're all different distances. So the conversion rate for degrees to radians is x amount of degrees multiplied by pi over 180 equals x amount of radians. And the same could be done to convert radians to degrees. So we take these radians, extra amount of radians, multiply it by 180 over pi, and then we get x amount of degrees. So the landmarks for the radians on the unit circle are 0 next to 0 degrees and pi next to 180. Additionally, if 360 was here, it would be 2 pi. So the pattern for the denominators goes 6, 4, 3, 2, 3, 4, 6. So once you get to 2, you kind of flip what was at the beginning. And this can go forwards or backwards, wherever you start. You could start from 0, you could start from pi. We're going to start from 0 and then go counterclockwise. So in the first quadrant, pi is always on top. So we'd have pi over 6, pi over 4, pi over 3, and pi over 2. Now in the second quadrant, there's a rule for the numerator, is that we subtract 1 from the denominator. So if we kind of continue the pattern of 2, 3, 4, 6, if we subtract 1 from 3, we'd get 2. So we'd get 2 pi over 3. Next is 3 pi over 4. And here is 5 pi over 6. Now this rule changes a little bit when we get to the third quadrant. Instead of subtracting 1, we're going to add 1 to the denominator and just continue the denominator pattern. So we end with 6, we're going to go back to 6, but add 1 to the denominator, which would be 7 pi over 6, 5 pi over 4, 4 pi over 3, and 3 pi over 2. Now these rules they're kind of similar, right? Add and subtract 1, but the fourth quadrant is a little different. You want to multiply the denominator by 2 and then subtract 1. So for example, since we had 2 here, and 3 is next. 3 times 2 is 6, minus 1 would be 5 pi over 3. For the next one, 4 times 2 is 8, minus 1 is 7 pi over 4. Then 6 times 2 is 12, minus 1 is 11, which gives us 11 pi over 6. So the next thing are the cosine and sine ordered pairs. Now these are harder to memorize, depending on the person, but I think this goes for most people. But with these key patterns, it may make it a little more easier. The first thing to note is that cosine represents the x or horizontal axis and sine represents the vertical. The denominator for the ordered pairs that exclude the horizontal and vertical points is always going to be 2. So wherever you see kind of like a diagonal line, one that's not straight up and down or side to side, the denominator of the fractions for both cosine and sine will be 2. The next pattern is that every numerator is square rooted except for 1. So whenever you see a 1, just leave it alone. It may have a negative sign, it may not, but do not put the square root sign next to it. Only numbers 2 and 3 will have the square root sign next to it, and the way we'd say it is rad 2 or rad 3. The next thing is kind of a phrase to help us memorize what's positive in each quadrant. All students take calculus. So in the first quadrant, all of them are positive. In the second quadrant, sine is positive. And in the third quadrant, tangent is positive, which we don't see on the unit circle, but this just means that sine and cosine are both negative. And in the last quadrant, the fourth quadrant, cosine is positive. Now, the next two things, I'm not sure if people generally use these patterns, but it helps me a lot, is for the numerators. So for cosine, which is the first number of the ordered pair, the number that's going to be in the numerator will go 3, 2, 1, 1, 2, 3 from the horizontal. And for sine, this would be 1, 2, 3, 3, 2, 1. This doesn't make a lot of sense right now, but once you see it in the circle, it'll kind of connect. Here's the circle again. I put the 2's in the denominator where there is supposed to be a fraction. We learned that the cosine value is the x value, and the radius of the unit circle is 1. And since there's no vertical change here, this would be 1, 0. Here at the top of the unit circle, we see that there's no movement across the x-axis, but there is on the y-axis. So this ordered pair would be 0, 1. Right here on the unit circle, we see that we shifted left, but no shift vertical, so this would be negative 1, 0. And applying those same principles down here, this would be 0, negative 1. Now those are kind of our landmarks for the ordered pairs. It may be a little confusing. You may switch up the 1s and 0s or the negative signs, but with enough practice, you'll understand where each one goes. We're going to start in the first quadrant. Now, if we remember our rule for cosine, the numerator would go 3, 2, 1, 1, 2, 3, and 2 and 3 both have the square root sign next to it. So, in this ordered pair, cosine would be rad 3 over 2. Here it will be rad 2 over 2, and here it will be just 1 over 2, or 1 half. Now, in the second quadrant, we notice that only sine is going to be positive, so these three values here are going to have a negative sign next to them. But we're going to continue with the numerator pattern, which is negative 1, negative rad 2 over 2, negative rad 3 over 2. In the third quadrant, tangent is positive, so cosine is negative. And following the pattern, we get negative rad 3 over 2, negative rad 2 over 2, and negative 1 over 2. And in the last quadrant, cosine is finally positive again, so we get 1 over 2, rad 2 over 2, and rad 3 over 2. And we've just filled out everything for the cosine. Now moving on to sine, we're back in the first quadrant, and the pattern is kind of the same but opposite. We're going to go 1, 2, 3, 3, 2, 1. So, with that being said, the first ordered pair would be filled in with 1/2 as sine, then rad 2 over 2, then rad 3 over 2. In the second quadrant, sine is positive, and continuing the pattern, we get rad 3 over 2, rad 2 over 2, and 1 over 2. Now in the third quadrant, both cosine and sine are going to be negative, so the values would be negative 1 over 2, negative rad 2 over 2, and negative rad 3 over 2. Finally, the last three numbers to fill in the fourth quadrant before we finally finish the unit circle will be negative rad 3 over 2, negative rad 2 over 2, and negative 1/2 for the sine values in the fourth quadrant. And there we have it. We have a full unit circle. Here's a neater picture if you want to take a screenshot to save. And some additional tips I have for you is to print out copies of the blank unit circle and quiz yourself. Try to fill out as much as possible. Maybe re-watch the tips in the video or look at the full circle for more guidance and to help you memorize. Now the next piece of advice is to try to fill out the circle in random orders. In this video, I mostly went counterclockwise, but it can get hard to memorize certain places in the unit circle when you're asked about them when you only know how to go in order. Kind of like the alphabet where you can't tell what exactly is the 15th letter. And my last piece of advice is to set the unit circle as your wallpaper. The more you see it, the more you'll memorize, and that's about it. Thank you for watching my video on memorizing the unit circle. Please like and subscribe if you learned something new, or comment if you have any questions, and I'll try my best to respond.